Chapter 2. Guardians of Virtue and the Myth of the Noble Lie. With these words I was thinking that I had put an end to the discussion, but the end, in truth, proved to be only a beginning. For Glaucon, who was always the most pugnacious of men, was dissatisfied at Thrasymachus' retirement. He wanted to have the battle out. So, he said to me, Socrates, do you wish really to persuade us, or only to seem to have persuaded us, that to be just is always better than to be unjust? I should really wish to persuade you, I replied, if I could. Then you certainly have not succeeded. Let me ask you now, how would you arrange goods? Are there not some which we welcome for their own sakes, and independently of their consequences, as, for example, harmless pleasures and enjoyments, which delight us at the time, although nothing follows from them? I agree in thinking that there is such a class, I replied. Is there not also another category of goods, like knowledge, vision, and health, which are desirable not only for themselves, but also for their outcomes? Certainly, I said. And would you not recognize a third category, such as exercise, taking care of the sick, and the expertise of a doctor? Also, the various ways of making money? These benefit us, but we consider them unpleasant. No one would choose them for their own sake, but only for the sake of some reward or outcome that comes from them. Yes, I said, there is this third category as well. But why do you ask? Because I want to know in which of the three categories you would place justice? In the highest category, I replied. Among those goods, someone who wants to be happy desires, both for their own sake and for the sake of their outcomes. Then most people have a different opinion. They think that justice should be placed in the troublesome category. Among goods that are pursued for the sake of rewards and reputation, but are unpleasant and rather to be avoided in themselves. I know, I said, that this is their way of thinking, and that this was the argument that Thrasymachus was making just now when he criticized justice and praised injustice. But I am too foolish to be convinced by him. I wish, he said, that you would hear me as well as him, and then I shall see whether you and I agree. For Thrasymachus seems to me, like a snake, to have been charmed by your voice sooner than he ought to have been. But to my mind, the nature of justice and injustice has not yet been made clear. Setting aside their rewards and outcomes, I want to know what they are in themselves, and how they inwardly work in the soul. If you please, then, I will revive the argument of Thrasymachus. And first, I will speak of the nature and origin of justice according to the common view of them. Secondly, I will show that all men who practice justice do so against their will, of necessity, but not as a good. And thirdly, I will argue that there is reason in this view, for the life of the unjust is after all better far than the life of the just, if what they say is true, Socrates, since I am not of their opinion. But still, I acknowledge that I am perplexed when I hear the voices of Thrasymachus and countless others dining in my ears. And, on the other hand, I have never yet heard the superiority of justice to injustice maintained by anyone in a satisfactory way. I want to hear justice praised in respect of itself. Then I shall be satisfied, and you are the person from whom I think that I am most likely to hear this. And therefore, I will praise the unjust life to the utmost of my power, and my manner of speaking will indicate the way I desire to hear you praising justice and criticizing injustice. Will you say whether you approve of my proposal? Indeed, I do. Nor can I imagine any theme about which a man of sense would often wish to converse. I am delighted, he replied, to hear you say so, and shall begin by speaking, as I proposed, of the nature and origin of justice. They say that to do injustice is, by nature, good. To suffer injustice, evil. But evil is greater than good. And so, when men have both done and suffered injustice, and have had experience of both, not being able to avoid the one and obtain the other, they think that they had better agree among themselves to have neither. Hence there arise laws and mutual agreements. And that which is ordained by law is termed by them lawful and just. This they affirm to be the origin and nature of justice. It is a means or compromise between the best of all, which is to do injustice and not be punished, and the worst of all, which is to suffer injustice without the power of retaliation. Justice, being at a middle point between the two, is tolerated not as a good, but as the lesser evil, and honored by reason of the inability of men to do injustice. For no man who is worthy to be called a man would ever submit to such an agreement if he were able to resist. He would be mad if he did. Such is the received account, Socrates, of the nature and origin of justice. Now, that those who practice justice do so involuntarily, and because they do not have the power to be unjust, will best appear if we imagine something of this kind. Having given both the just and the unjust power to do what they will, let us watch and see where desire will lead them. Then we shall discover in the very act the just and unjust man proceeding along the same road, following their interest, which all natures deem to be their good, and are only diverted into the path of justice by the force of law. The liberty which we are supposing may be most completely given to them in the form of such a power as is said to have been possessed by Gyges, the ancestor of Croesus the Lydian. According to tradition, Gyges was a shepherd in the service of the king of Lydia. There was a great storm, and an earthquake made an opening in the earth at the place where he was feeding his flock. Amazed at the sight, he descended into the opening, where, among other marvels, he beheld a hollow brazen horse, having doors. Stooping and looking in, he saw a dead body of stature, as it appeared to him, more than human, and having nothing on but a gold ring. He took this ring from the finger of the dead and reascended. Now, the shepherds gathered, as was their tradition, to send their monthly report about the flocks to the king. Among them, a man came wearing a ring on his finger. As he sat with them, he accidentally turned the setting of the ring inside his hand, and suddenly he became invisible to the rest of the group. They began to speak of him as if he were no longer present. He was surprised by this, and when he turned the setting of the ring outwards, he reappeared. He tried this several times, always with the same result. When the setting was turned inwards, he became invisible, and when it was turned outwards, he reappeared. Intrigued by this power, he managed to be chosen as one of the messengers sent to the court. Once he arrived at the court, he seduced the queen and conspired with her against the king. They killed him and took over the kingdom. Now, let us imagine that there were two such magic rings, and one was worn by a righteous person and the other by an unjust person. It is impossible to imagine that anyone would remain steadfast in their sense of justice. No one would refrain from taking what is not rightfully theirs when they could do so without consequence. They would enter houses and sleep with anyone they pleased, kill or release prisoners at will, and essentially act like a god among men. In the end, the actions of the righteous and the unjust would be the same. This is a great proof that a person is just not because they willingly choose to be, or because they believe justice is beneficial to them individually, but out of necessity. Whenever someone believes they can safely be unjust, they will be unjust. Deep down, everyone believes that injustice is more profitable to the individual than justice, and anyone who argues otherwise would be deemed foolish. If we can imagine someone obtaining the power of invisibility and using it without doing wrong or taking what belongs to others, they would be seen as a pitiful fool by onlookers. Though they may be praised in their face, others would fear suffering injustice and therefore maintain appearances. But enough of this. If we want to truly judge the lives of the just and unjust, we must isolate them. There is no other way. But how can we achieve this isolation? Let the unjust person be completely unjust, and the just person be completely just. Nothing should be taken away from either of them, or both should be fully equipped for their respective lives. First, let us imagine the unjust person as a skilled craftsman, like a pilot or a physician. They know their own abilities and limitations, and if they make a mistake, they can recover. So let the unjust person make their unjust attempts in a calculated manner, hidden if they wish to excel in their injustice. For someone who is discovered is nobody. The highest form of injustice is to be seen as just when you are not. Therefore, in our perfectly unjust person, we must assume the most perfect injustice. We should not deduct anything, but rather allow them to have the greatest reputation for justice, even as they commit the most unjust acts. If they make a misstep, they should be able to recover. They should be able to speak effectively if any of their deeds come to light, and they should possess the courage, strength, money, and friends necessary to force their way when needed. Beside them, let us place the just person in their nobility and simplicity, desiring, as Aeschylus says, to be good and not just to appear good. There should be no semblance of goodness, for if they appear just, they will be honored and rewarded. Then, we will not know if they are just for the sake of justice or for the sake of honors and rewards. Therefore, let them be clothed only in justice, with no other covering. We must imagine them living a life completely opposite to the unjust person. Let them be the best of people, but thought of as the worst. This will test them, and we will see if they are affected by the fear of infamy and its consequences. They must continue in this manner until their death, being just but appearing unjust. When both the just and unjust have reached the extreme of their respective paths, let judgment be given to determine which of them is happier. My dear Glaucon, I exclaimed, you have presented their cases with such energy, as if they were two statues. I will do my best, he replied. Now that we know what they are like, it is not difficult to imagine the kind of life that awaits each of them. Allow me to describe it, but please understand, Socrates, that the following words are not mine. Let me put them into the mouths of the advocates of injustice. They will tell you that the just person who is thought to be unjust will be punished severely. They will be scourged, tortured, bound, have their eyes burned out, and ultimately, after enduring every kind of evil, they will be impaled. Then, they will understand that they should only appear just and not actually be just. The words of Aeschylus may be more accurately applied to the unjust than to the just. For the unfair is pursuing a reality, he does not live with a view to appearances, he wants to be truly unfair and not to seem only, his mind has a soil deep and fertile, out of which spring his wise counsels. In the first place, he is thought fair, and therefore bears rule in the city, he can marry whom he will, and give in marriage to whom he will, also he can trade and deal where he likes, and always to his own advantage, because he has no doubts about injustice, and at every contest, whether in public or private, he gets the better of his opponents, and gains at their expense, and is rich, and out of his gains he can benefit his friends, and harm his enemies. Moreover, he can offer sacrifices, and dedicate gifts to the gods abundantly and magnificently, and can honor the gods or any man whom he wants to honor in a far better style than the fair, and therefore he is likely to be dearer than they are to the gods. And thus, Socrates, gods and men are said to unite in making the life of the unfair better than the life of the fair. I was going to say something in answer to Glaucon, when Adimantus, his brother, interposed. Socrates, he said, you do not suppose that there is nothing more to be urged? Why, what else is there? I answered. The strongest point of all has not even been mentioned, he replied. Well, then, according to the proverb, let brother help brother, if he fails in any part do you assist him, although I must confess that Glaucon has already said quite enough to lay me in the dust and take from me the power of helping justice. Nonsense, he replied. But let me add something more. There is another side to Glaucon's argument about the praise and censure of justice and injustice, which is equally required to bring out what I believe to be his meaning. Parents and tutors are always telling their sons and their words that they are to be just, but why? Not for the sake of justice, but for the sake of character and reputation, in the hope of obtaining for him who is reputed just some of those offices, marriages, and the like which Glaucon has enumerated among the advantages accruing to the unfair from the reputation of justice. More, however, is made of appearances by this class of persons than by the others, for they throw in the good opinion of the gods, and will tell you of a shower of benefits which the heavens, as they say, rain upon the pious, and this accords with the testimony of the noble Hesiod and Homer, the first of whom says, that the gods make the oaks of the fair, to bear acorns at their summit, and bees in the middle, and the sheep are bowed down with the weight of their fleeces, and many other blessings of a like kind are provided for them. And Homer has a very similar strain, for he speaks of one whose fame is, as the fame of some blameless king who, like a god, maintains justice, to whom the black earth brings forth wheat and barley, whose trees are bowed with fruit, and his sheep never fail to bear, and the sea gives him fish. Still grander are the gifts of heaven which Musaeus and his son vouchsafe to the fair. They take them down into the world below, where they have the saints lying on couches at a feast, everlastingly drunk, crowned with garlands. Their idea seems to be that an immortality of drunkenness is the highest need of virtue. Some extend their rewards yet further. The posterity, as they say, of the faithful and just shall survive to the third and fourth generation. This is the style in which they praise justice. But about the wicked there is another strain. They bury them in a slough in Hades, and make them carry water in a sieve. Also, while they are yet living, they bring them to infamy, and inflict upon them the punishments which Glaucon described as the portion of the fair who are reputed to be unfair. Nothing else does their invention supply. Such is their manner of praising one and censuring the other. Once more, Socrates, I will ask you to consider another way of speaking about justice and injustice, which is not confined to the poets, but is found in prose writers. The universal voice of mankind is always declaring that justice and virtue are honorable, but grievous and toilsome, and that the pleasures of vice and injustice are easy of attainment and are only censured by law and opinion. They say also that honesty is for the most part less profitable than dishonesty, and they are quite ready to call wicked men happy, and to honor them both in public and private when they are rich or in any other way influential, while they despise and overlook those who may be weak and poor, even though acknowledging them to be better than the others. But most extraordinary of all is their mode of speaking about virtue and the gods. They say that the gods apportion calamity and misery to many good men, and good and happiness to the wicked. And mendicant prophets go to rich men's doors and persuade them that they have a power committed to them by the gods of making an atonement for a man's own or his ancestors' sins by sacrifices or charms, with rejoicings and feasts, and they promise to harm an enemy, whether just or unjust, at a small cost, with magic arts and incantations binding heaven, as they say, to execute their will. And the poets are the authorities to whom they appeal, now smoothing the path of vice with the words of Hesiod. Vice may be had in abundance without trouble, the way is smooth, and her dwelling place is near. But before goodness, the gods have set work, and a tedious and challenging path. Then citing Homer as a witness that the gods may be influenced by men, for he also says, the gods, too, may be swayed from their purpose, and men pray to them and appease their anger by sacrifices and soothing pleas, and by offerings and the scent of fat, when they have sinned and transgressed. And they produce a multitude of books written by Musaeus and Orpheus, who were offspring of the moon and the muses, that is what they say, according to which they perform their ritual, and convince not only individuals but entire cities that expiations and amends for wrongdoing may be made by sacrifices and entertainments which fill a vacant hour, and are equally available to the living and the dead. The latter kind they call mysteries, and they save us from the torments of hell, but if we neglect them no one knows what awaits us. Socrates, my dear friend, when the young hear all this said about goodness and vice, and the way in which gods and men regard them, how are their minds likely to be affected? Those of them, I mean, who are quick-witted, and, like bees on the wing, light on every flower, and from all that they hear are prone to draw conclusions as to what kind of people they should be, and in what way they should live if they would make the most of life. Probably the youth will say to himself in the words of Pindar, can I by fairness or by deceitful ways ascend a higher tower which may be a stronghold to me all my days? For what people say is that if I am truly fair and am not also considered fair, there is no benefit, but the pain and loss on the other hand are evident. But if, though unfair, I gain the reputation of fairness, a heavenly life is promised to me. Since then, as philosophers prove, appearance dominates over truth and is master of happiness, to appearance I must devote myself. I will create around me an image and shadow of goodness to be the entrance and exterior of my house. Behind I will follow the cunning and deceitful fox, as Archilochus, greatest of sages, recommends. But I hear someone exclaiming that the concealment of wickedness is often difficult, to which I answer, nothing great is easy. Nevertheless, the argument indicates this, if we would be happy, to be the path along which we should proceed. With the intention of concealment, we will establish secret societies and political clubs. And there are professors of rhetoric who teach the art of persuading courts and assemblies, and so, partly by persuasion and partly by force, I shall make unlawful gains and not be punished. Still, I hear a voice saying that the gods cannot be deceived, neither can they be compelled. But what if there are no gods? Or, suppose they have no care of human things, why in either case should we mind about concealment? And even if there are gods, and they do care about us, yet we know of them only from tradition and the genealogies of the poets, and these are the very individuals who say that they may be influenced and turned by sacrifices and soothing pleas and by offerings. Let us be consistent then, and believe both or neither. If the poets speak truly, why then we had better be unfair and offer of the fruits of unfairness, for if we are fair, although we may escape the punishment of heaven, we shall lose the gains of unfairness, but if we are unfair, we shall keep the gains, and by our wrongdoing and praying and wrongdoing, the gods will be appeased, and we shall not be punished. But there is an underworld in which either we or our descendants will suffer for our unfair deeds. Yes, my friend, will be the thought, but there are mysteries and atoning deities, and these have great power. That is what mighty cities declare, and the offspring of the gods, who were their poets and prophets, bear a similar testimony. On what principle, then, shall we any longer choose fairness rather than the worst unfairness? When, if we only combine the latter with a deceitful regard to appearances, we shall fare to our liking both with gods and men, in life and after death, as the most numerous and the highest authorities tell us. Knowing all this, Socrates, how can a man who has any superiority of mind or person or rank or wealth be willing to honor fairness? Or indeed, to refrain from laughing when he hears fairness praised? And even if there should be someone who is able to disprove the truth of my words, and who is convinced that fairness is best, still he is not angry with the unfair, but is very ready to forgive them because he also knows that men are not fair of their own free will, unless, perhaps, there be someone whom the divinity within him may have inspired with a hatred of unfairness, or who has attained knowledge of the truth, but no other man. He only blames unfairness who, owing to cowardice or age or some weakness, does not have the power of being unfair. And this is proven by the fact that when he obtains power, he immediately becomes unfair as much as he can be. The cause of all this, Socrates, was indicated by us at the beginning of the argument when my brother and I told you how astonished we were to find that of all the professing advocates of fairness, beginning with the ancient heroes of whom any record has been preserved to us, and ending with the men of our own time, no one has ever blamed unfairness or praised fairness except with a view to the glories, honors, and benefits which flow from them. No one has ever adequately described the true nature of justice and injustice, which reside in the soul and are invisible to human and divine eyes. No one has shown that justice is the greatest good and injustice the greatest evil. If this message had been universal, if we had been taught this from a young age, we would not be cautious of each other's wrongdoing. Everyone would be responsible for their own actions, afraid of harboring the greatest evil within themselves if they did wrong. I dare say that Thrasymachus and others would seriously hold the distorted views on justice and injustice that I have been repeating. But I speak passionately because I want to hear the opposing side. I want to understand not only the superiority of justice over injustice, but also the effects they have on the person who possesses them, which make one good and the other bad. Please, as Glaucon asked, exclude reputations. If you do not take away their true reputations and add false ones, we will think that you are only praising the appearance of justice and encouraging us to hide injustice. We will think that you agree with Thrasymachus, believing that justice is the good of others and the interest of the stronger, while injustice is a person's own profit and interest, though harmful to the weaker. Now, since you have admitted that justice is one of the highest class of goods that are desired for their own sake, I ask you to consider one point in your praise of justice, the essential good and evil that justice and injustice bring about in the possessors of them. Let others praise justice and criticize injustice, magnifying the rewards and honors of one and condemning the other. I am willing to tolerate that argument from them. But from you, who have spent your whole life contemplating this question, I expect something better. Show us not only that justice is better than injustice, but also what they do to the possessor, which makes one good and the other bad, whether seen or unseen by gods and men. I had always admired the genius of Glaucon and Adeimantus, but on hearing these words, I was quite delighted. I said, "Sons of a distinguished father," that was not a bad beginning of the elegiac verses which the admirer of Glaucon made in honor of you after you had distinguished yourselves at the battle of Megara, sons of Ariston, he sang, divine offspring of a distinguished hero. The epithet is very appropriate, for there is something truly divine in being able to argue as you have done for the superiority of injustice and remaining unconvinced by your own arguments. And I do believe that you are not convinced, this I infer from your general character, for had I judged only from your speeches, I would have doubted you. But now, the more confident I am in you, the greater is my difficulty in knowing what to say. For I am torn between two. On the one hand, I feel that I am not up to the task, and my inability is made clear to me by the fact that you were not satisfied with the answer which I gave to Thrasymachus, proving, as I thought, the superiority of justice over injustice. And yet I cannot refuse to help, while breath and speech remain to me. I am afraid that it would be impious to be present when justice is spoken of badly and not raise a hand in her defense. And therefore, I had better give such help as I can. Glaucon and the rest begged me not to let the question drop, but to continue the investigation. They wanted to arrive at the truth about the nature of justice and injustice and their relative advantages. I told them that the inquiry would be serious and would require keen observation. Seeing that we are not great intellectuals, I suggested a method. Suppose a nearsighted person was asked to read small letters from a distance. If someone else suggested that larger letters could be found in another place, and the person could read the larger letters first and then proceed to the smaller ones, that would be fortunate. Very true, said Adeimantus, but how does the illustration apply to our inquiry? I explained that justice, the subject of our inquiry, is sometimes spoken of as the virtue of an individual and sometimes as the virtue of a state. A state is larger than an individual, so the quantity of justice is likely to be larger and more easily discernible in the state. Therefore, I propose that we investigate the nature of justice and injustice first as they appear in the state, and then in the individual, comparing them from the larger to the smaller. That, he said, is a fantastic proposal. And if we imagine the government in the process of creation, we shall see the fairness and unfairness of the government in the process of creation as well. I dare say. When the government is completed, there may be a hope that the object of our search will be more easily discovered. Yes, much more easily. But should we attempt to construct one? I said, because to do so, as I am inclined to think, will be a very serious task. Reflect, therefore. I have reflected, said Adeimantus, and am anxious that you should proceed. A government, I said, arises, as I conceive, out of the needs of mankind. No one is self-sufficient, but all of us have many wants. Can any other origin of a government be imagined? There can be no other, Adeimantus replied. Then, as we have many wants, and many people are needed to supply them, one takes a helper for one purpose and another for another, and when these partners and helpers are gathered together in one habitation, the body of inhabitants is called a government. True, he said. And they exchange with one another, and one gives, and another receives, under the idea that the exchange will be for their good. Very true. Then, I said, let us begin and create an idea government, and yet the true creator is necessity, who is the mother of our invention. Of course, he replied. Now the first and greatest of necessities is food, which is the condition of life and existence. Certainly. The second is a dwelling, and the third clothing and the like. True. And now let us see how our city will be able to supply this great demand, We may suppose that one man is a farmer, another a builder, someone else a weaver, shall we add to them a shoemaker, or perhaps some other provider to our bodily wants? Quite right. The barest notion of a government must include 4 or 5 men. Clearly. And how will they proceed? Will each bring the result of his labors into a common stock, the individual farmer, for example, producing for 4, and working 4 times as long and as much as he need in the provision of food with which he supplies others as well as himself, or will he have nothing to do with others and not be at the trouble of producing for them, but provide for himself alone 1/4 of the food in 1/4 of the time, and in the remaining 3/4 of his time be employed in making a house or a coat or a pair of shoes, having no partnership with others, but providing himself all his own wants? Adimantus thought that he should aim at producing food only, and not at producing everything. Probably, I replied, that would be the better way, and when I hear you say this, I am myself reminded that we are not all alike. There are diversities of natures among us which are adapted to different occupations. Very true. And will you have a work better done when the worker has many occupations, or when he has only one? When he has only one. Further, there can be no doubt that a work is spoiled when not done at the right time. No doubt. For business is not disposed to wait until the doer of the business is at leisure, but the doer must follow up what he is doing and make the business his first object. He must. And if so, we must infer that all things are produced more plentifully and easily and of a better quality when one man does one thing which is natural to him and does it at the right time and leaves other things. Undoubtedly. Then more than 4 citizens will be required, for the farmer will not make his own plow or mattock, or other implements of agriculture, if they are to be good for anything. Neither will the builder make his tools, and he too needs many, and in like manner the weaver and shoemaker. True. Then carpenters, and smiths, and many other artisans, will be sharers in our little government, which is already beginning to grow? True. Yet even if we add cattle herders, shepherds, and other herdsmen, in order that our farmers may have oxen to plow with, and builders as well as farmers may have draft cattle, and kayas, and weavers' fleeces and hides, still our government will not be very large. That is true, yet neither will it be a very small government which contains all these, or other implements of agriculture, if they are to be good for anything. Then, again, there is the location of the city. To find a place where nothing need be imported is almost impossible. Impossible. Then there must be another class of citizens who will bring the required supply from another city? There must. But if the trader goes empty-handed, having nothing which they require who would supply his need, he will come back empty-handed. That is certain. And therefore, what they produce at home must be not only enough for themselves, but such both in quantity and quality as to accommodate those from whom their wants are supplied. Very true. Then more farmers and more artisans will be required? They will. Not to mention the importers and exporters, who are called merchants. Yes. Then we shall want merchants? We shall. And if merchandise is to be carried over the sea, skilled sailors will also be needed, and in considerable numbers? Yes, in considerable numbers. Then, again, within the city, how will they exchange their productions? To secure such an exchange was, as you will remember, one of our principal objects when we formed them into a society and constituted a government. Clearly they will buy and sell. Then they will need a marketplace and a money token for purposes of exchange. Certainly. Suppose now that a farmer, or an artisan, brings some production to market, and he comes at a time when there is no one to exchange with him, is he to leave his calling and sit idle in the marketplace? Not at all. He will find people there who, seeing the want, undertake the office of salesman. In well-ordered societies, they are usually the weakest in physical strength, who have little use for any other purpose. Their duty is to be in the marketplace and exchange money for goods with those who want to sell and take money from those who want to buy. This creates a class of retail traders in our state. Is a retailer the term applied to those who sit in the marketplace engaged in buying and selling, while those who wander from one city to another are called merchants? Yes, he said. And there is another class of servants, who are intellectually hardly on the level of companionship, still, they have plenty of physical strength for labor, which they sell and are called hirelings, hire being the name given to the price of their labor. True. Then hirelings will help to make up our population? Yes. And now, Adimantus, is our state mature and perfected? I think so. Where, then, is justice, and where is injustice, and in what part of the state did they spring up? Probably in the dealings of these citizens with one another. I cannot imagine that they are more likely to be found anywhere else. I dare say that you are right in your suggestion, I said. We had better think the matter out and not shrink from the inquiry. Let us then consider, first, what will be their way of life now that we have established them like this. Will they not produce corn, wine, clothes, and shoes, and build houses for themselves? And when they are housed, they will work, in summer, commonly, stripped and barefoot, but in winter substantially clothed and shod. They will feed on barley meal and flour of wheat, baking and kneading them, making noble cakes and loaves. These they will serve up on a mat of reeds or on clean leaves, themselves reclining the while upon beds strewn with yew or myrtle. And they and their children will feast, drinking the wine which they have made, wearing garlands on their heads, and hymning the praises of the gods, in happy converse with one another. And they will take care that their families do not exceed their means, having an eye on poverty or war. But, said Glaucon, interposing, you have not given them a relish to their meal. True, I replied, I had forgotten, of course, they must have a relish, salt, and olives, and cheese, and they will boil roots and herbs such as country people prepare. For dessert, we shall give them figs, and peas, and beans, and they will roast myrtle berries and acorns at the fire, drinking in moderation. And with such a diet, they may be expected to live in peace and health to a good old age and bequeath a similar life to their children after them. Yes, Socrates, he said, and if you were providing for a city of pigs, how else would you feed the beasts? But what would you have, Glaucon? I replied. Why, he said, you should give them the ordinary conveniences of life. People who are to be comfortable are accustomed to lying on sofas and dining off tables, and they should have sauces and sweets in the modern style. Yes, I said, now I understand. The question which you would have me consider is, not only how a state, but how a luxurious state is created, and possibly there is no harm in this, for in such a state we shall be more likely to see how justice and injustice originate. In my opinion, the true and healthy constitution of the state is the one which I have described. But if you wish also to see a state at fever heat, I have no objection. For I suspect that many will not be satisfied with the simpler way of life. They will be for adding sofas, tables, and other furniture. Also, dainties, perfumes, incense, courtesans, and cakes, all in various varieties. This goes beyond the necessaries of houses, clothes, and shoes that I mentioned earlier. Now, the arts of painters and embroiderers will need to be utilized, along with the procurement of gold, ivory, and other materials. True, he said. Then we must expand our borders, because the original healthy state is no longer sufficient. The city will now be filled with a multitude of callings that are not driven by natural wants. This includes hunters, actors, musicians, poets, dancers, and makers of various articles, including women's dresses. We will also need more servants, tutors, nurses, tire women, barbers, confectioners, cooks, and even swineherds. These were not needed in the previous version of our state, but now they are necessary. And there will be a need for animals of different kinds, depending on people's preferences for consumption. Certainly, he replied. Living in this manner, we will require a greater number of physicians than before. The country that was once enough to support the original inhabitants will now be too small and insufficient. Therefore, we will need to acquire a portion of our neighbors' land for pasture and cultivation, and they will want a portion of ours if they also exceed the limit of necessity and pursue unlimited wealth. This will inevitably lead to war, Glaucon. Shall we not? I asked. Most certainly, he replied. At this point, we cannot determine whether war does good or harm. However, we can affirm that war is derived from causes that are also the causes of almost all the evils in states, both private and public. Undoubtedly, he agreed. Our country must grow once again, this time like an entire army. We will have to go out and fight with the invaders for everything we have, including the people and things we previously discussed. Why? He asked. Are they not capable of defending themselves? No, I said. Not if we were correct in the principle we all agreed upon when we created the country. The principle was that one person cannot successfully practice many skills. Very true, he said. But isn't war a skill? I asked. Certainly, I replied. And it requires as much attention as shoemaking. True, he said. We did not allow the shoemaker to be a farmer, weaver, or builder, so that our shoes would be well made. Each worker was assigned one job they were naturally suited for, and they were to continue working at that job for their entire life. They were not to let opportunities slip away, and by doing so, they would become skilled workers. Now, nothing is more important than a soldier doing their job well. But is war a skill that can be easily acquired by someone who is also a farmer, shoemaker, or other artisan? No one in the world would become a good dice or draft player just by playing the game as a recreation. They would need to devote themselves to it from an early age and focus on it exclusively. No tools will make someone a skilled worker or master of defense if they have not learned how to handle them and have never paid attention to them. So, how will someone who picks up a shield or other war implement become a good fighter in just one day? Whether it's with heavy armed troops or any other kind, it takes time and practice. Yes, he said. The tools that would teach people their use would be invaluable. And the higher the duties of the guardian, the more time, skill, and application they will need, I said. No doubt, he replied. Will they not also require a natural aptitude for their calling? I asked. Certainly, he said. So, it will be our duty to select, if we can, individuals who are suited for the task of guarding the city? I spoke. It will, he agreed. And the selection will not be easy, but we must be brave and do our best. We must, I said. Isn't the noble youth very much like a well-bred dog when it comes to guarding and watching? What do you mean? He asked. I mean that both of them should be quick to see and swift to catch the enemy when they see them. And they should be strong too in case they have to fight with the enemy after catching them, I explained. All these qualities will certainly be required of them, he replied. Well, your guardian must be brave if they are to fight well, I said. Certainly, he agreed. And is someone likely to be brave if they have no spirit, whether they are a horse, dog, or any other animal? Have you not observed how invincible and unconquerable spirit is? It makes the soul of any creature fearless and indomitable, I said. I have, he said. Now we have a clear understanding of the physical qualities required in a guardian, I said. True, he replied. And also, the mental ones. Their soul must be full of spirit. Yes, I said. But aren't these spirited natures prone to being aggressive towards each other and everyone else? That is a difficulty that is not easy to overcome, he admitted. But they should be dangerous to their enemies and gentle to their friends. Otherwise, they will destroy themselves without waiting for their enemies to destroy them, I said. True, he said. So, what should we do? I asked. How can we find a gentle nature that also has great spirit? Because the two qualities seem contradictory, I said. That is a challenge, he replied. It seems impossible to find someone who possesses both qualities and would make a good guardian. I'm afraid what you say is true, I said, feeling perplexed. I began to think about what we had discussed. My friend, I said, no wonder we are perplexed. We have lost sight of the image we had in mind. What do you mean? He asked. I mean that there are indeed natures gifted with those opposite qualities, I explained. And where do you find them? He asked. Many animals provide examples of them. Our friend, the dog, is a good example. Well-bred dogs are gentle with familiar people and aggressive towards strangers, I said. Yes, I know, he said. So, it is not impossible or against nature to find a guardian who has a similar combination of qualities, I said. Certainly not, he agreed. Wouldn't someone who is fit to be a guardian need to have the qualities of a philosopher, in addition to the spirited nature? I asked. I don't understand what you mean, he said. The trait I'm talking about can also be seen in dogs. It's remarkable in the animal, I said. What trait? He asked. Well, a dog gets angry when it sees a stranger and welcomes an acquaintance, even if the stranger has never done any harm and the acquaintance has never done any good. Did you ever find that curious? I asked. It never struck me before, but I recognize the truth in your remark, he said. And surely, this instinct of the dog is very charming. Your dog is a true philosopher, I said. Why? He asked. Because he distinguishes between the face of a friend and an enemy based on knowing and not knowing, I explained. And must an animal not be a lover of learning who determines what he likes and dislikes by the test of knowledge and ignorance? Most definitely. And is not the love of learning the love of wisdom, which is philosophy? They are the same, he replied. And may we not confidently say that a man who is likely to be gentle to his friends and acquaintances must, by nature, be a lover of wisdom and knowledge? We can safely affirm that. Then he who is to be a truly good and noble guardian of the state will need to combine philosophy, spirit, swiftness, and strength. Undoubtedly. Then we have found the desired natures, and now that we have found them, how are they to be raised and educated? Is this not an inquiry that may shed light on the greater inquiry, which is our goal? How does justice and injustice develop in states? We do not want to omit anything relevant or make the argument too long. Adimantus thought that the inquiry would be of great service to us. Then, I said, my dear friend, we must not give up the task, even if it takes some time. Certainly not. Come then, and let us spend some leisure time in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes. By all means. And what shall be their education? Can we find a better one than the traditional kind? This has two divisions, physical training for the body, and music for the soul. True. Shall we begin education with music and then move on to physical training? By all means. And when you speak of music, do you include literature as well? I do. And literature can be either true or false. Yes. And should the young be trained in both kinds, starting with the false? I do not understand what you mean, he said. You know, I said, that we begin by telling children stories which, though not entirely devoid of truth, are mostly fictional. And we tell them these stories when they are not old enough to learn physical training. Very true. That was my meaning when I said that we must teach music before physical training. Quite right, he said. You also know that the beginning is the most important part of any work, especially when it concerns a young and tender thing, for that is when the character is being formed and the desired impression is more easily made. Quite true. So, shall we carelessly allow children to hear any random tales that may be invented by random people, and let them absorb ideas that are mostly the opposite of what we would want them to have when they grow up? We cannot. Then the first thing we must do is establish a censorship of fiction writers, and let the censors accept good works of fiction and reject the bad ones. We will instruct mothers and nurses to only tell their children the approved ones. Let them shape the mind with such stories, even more lovingly than if they shape the body with their hands. But most of the stories that are currently in use must be discarded. What stories are you referring to? He said. You can find a model of the lesser stories in the greater ones, I said, for they are of the same type and spirit. Very likely, he replied, but I don't yet know what you mean by the greater stories. I mean those stories narrated by Homer and Hesiod, and the other poets who have always been the great storytellers of humanity. But which stories do you mean, he said, and what is wrong with them? The most serious fault, I said, is that they tell a lie, and not just any lie, but a bad one. But when is this fault committed? Whenever an erroneous portrayal is made of the nature of gods and heroes, like when a painter paints a portrait that bears no resemblance to the original. Yes, he said, that sort of thing is certainly very blameworthy, but which stories do you mean? First, I said, there is that greatest of all lies in high places, which the poet told about Uranus, and which was also a bad lie. I mean what Hesiod says Uranus did, and how Cronus retaliated against him. The actions of Cronus and the sufferings inflicted upon him by his son should not be casually told to young and thoughtless individuals. If necessary, they should be kept silent or only shared with a select few in secret. And if mentioned, it should be done with a rare and unobtainable victim as a sacrifice to ensure that only a few people hear the stories. These stories are extremely objectionable and should not be repeated in our state. Young men should not be taught that committing the worst crimes is not outrageous and that chastising their fathers for wrongdoing is following the example of the gods. I completely agree that these stories are unsuitable. We should also avoid mentioning the wars in heaven, the plots and fights of the gods, and the battles of the giants. These stories, whether true or not, should not be included in our state. We should teach our future guardians that quarreling is unholy and that there has never been a quarrel between citizens. Old men and women should begin by telling children this, and poets should compose similar stories for them when they grow up. But tales like Hephaestus binding his mother Hera or the battles of the gods in Homer should not be included in our state, whether they have an allegorical meaning or not. Young people cannot differentiate between allegory and literal truth, and what they receive at a young age becomes ingrained in their minds. Therefore, it is crucial that the tales they hear first are models of virtuous thoughts. If someone asks where these models can be found and what tales we are referring to, we, as founders of a state, should know the general forms in which poets should shape their tales and the limits they must observe. However, creating tales is not our business. We must represent God as he truly is, regardless of the type of poetry used. God is truly good and must be portrayed as such. No good thing is harmful, and that which does not cause harm does not evil. Good is beneficial and the cause of well-being. Therefore, if God is good, he is not the creator of all things, but only of a few. Most things that happen to people, including many evils, cannot be attributed to God. The causes of these evils must be sought elsewhere. We must not listen to poets who claim that Zeus holds two casks, one of good and one of evil lots, and that he dispenses them to people. We must not approve of claims that the violation of oaths and treaties or the strife and contention of the gods were instigated by Athena, Zeus, or any other deity. Poets must not say that the sufferings of Niobe or the tragedies of the house of Pelops or the Trojan War are the works of God. If they do, they must provide an explanation, such as God doing what is just and right or that the punished are better off for it. But they must not say that those who are punished are miserable and that God is the cause of their misery. The poet can say that the wicked are miserable because they need to be punished and benefit from receiving punishment from God. However, it is strongly denied saying that God, being good, is the author of evil to anyone. These ideas should not be said, sung, or heard in any well-ordered commonwealth, by anyone, old or young, in verse or prose. Such a fiction is self-destructive, ruinous, and impious. I agree with you, he replied, and I am ready to give my assent to the law. Let this then be one of our rules and principles concerning the gods, to which our poets and reciters will be expected to adhere, that God is not the author of all things, but only of good. That will do, he said. And what do you think of a second principle? Shall I ask you whether God is a magician, and of a nature to appear deceptively now in one form, and now in another, sometimes changing himself and taking on many forms, sometimes deceiving us with the appearance of such transformations? Or is he one and the same, unchanging, and fixed in his own true image? I cannot answer you without more thought. Well, I said, but if we suppose a change in anything, that change must be brought about either by the thing itself or by something else. Most certainly. And things that are at their best are also least likely to be altered or disturbed. For example, when the human body is healthiest and strongest, it is least likely to be affected by food and drinks. Similarly, a plant that is in full vigor suffers least from winds or the heat of the sun. This principle applies to all composite things, such as furniture, houses, and garments. When they are good and well made, they are least changed by time and circumstances. Yes, that makes sense. And wouldn't the bravest and wisest soul be least confused or disturbed by any external influence? That's true. The same principle applies to all composite things. When they are good, whether made by art or nature, they are least likely to suffer change from outside. That's true. But surely God and the things of God are perfect in every way? Of course, they are. Then God cannot be compelled by external influence to take many forms? No, he cannot. But can't he change and transform himself? If he changes at all, it must be for the worse. We cannot suppose he is deficient in virtue or beauty. That's true, Adimantus. But would anyone, whether God or man, desire to make himself worse? No, it's impossible. Therefore, it is impossible for God to ever be willing to change. Being the fairest and best that is conceivable, every God remains absolutely and forever in his own form. That necessarily follows, in my judgment. Then, my dear friend, let none of the poets tell us that the gods disguise themselves as strangers and walk among cities in different forms. Let no one slander Proteus and Thetis. Let no one, in tragedy or any other kind of poetry, introduce here disguised as a priestess asking for alms. Let's have no more lies of that sort. And mothers should not scare their children with bad versions of these myths. They should not tell them how certain gods go about by night in the guise of strangers. They should be careful not to make cowards of their children and speak blasphemy against the gods. Heaven forbid. But although the gods themselves are unchangeable, can't they make us think that they appear in various forms through witchcraft and deception? Perhaps that's possible. But can you imagine that God would be willing to lie, whether in word or deed, or to present a phantom of himself? I cannot say. Don't you know that the true lie is hated by gods and men? What do you mean? I mean that no one willingly deceives themselves about the truest and highest part of themselves or about the truest and highest matters. They are most afraid of a lie having possession of them. I still don't understand. The reason is that you attribute some profound meaning to my words. I'm simply saying that deception or being deceived or uninformed about the highest realities in the soul is what mankind detests the most. There is nothing more hateful to them. And, as I was saying earlier, this ignorance in the soul of the deceived person can be called the true lie. The lie in words is only an imitation and shadowy image of a previous affection of the soul, not pure unadulterated falsehood. Do you agree? Yes, you're perfectly right. The true lie is hated not only by the gods, but also by men. While the lie in words can be useful and not hateful in certain cases, such as when dealing with enemies or preventing harm from friends who are in a fit of madness or illusion, or in the tales of mythology where we don't know the truth about ancient times, and so we make falsehood as much like truth as we can. That's very true. But can any of these reasons apply to God? Can we suppose that he is ignorant of antiquity and therefore resorts to invention? That would be ridiculous. So, the lying poet has no place in our idea of God? I would say no. Or perhaps God may tell a lie because he is afraid of enemies? That is inconceivable. but he may have friends who are senseless or mad. But no mad or senseless person can be a friend of God. Therefore, no motive can be imagined why God should lie. None at all. So, the superhuman and divine is incapable of falsehood? Yes. God is perfectly simple and true in word and deed. He does not change and does not deceive either by sign or word, by dream or waking vision. Your thoughts reflect my own. You agree with me, then, that this is the second type or form in which we should write and speak about divine things. The gods are not magicians who transform themselves, nor do they deceive mankind in any way. I agree with that. Then, even though we admire Homer, we do not admire the false dream that Zeus sends to Agamemnon, nor will we praise the verses of Aeschylus in which Thetis says that Apollo at her wedding was celebrating in song her beautiful children whose lives were to be long, and to know no illness. And when he had spoken of my fate as blessed by heaven in all things, he raised a note of triumph and cheered my soul. And I believed that the word of Phoebus, being divine and full of prophecy, would not fail. And now he himself who spoke those words, he who was present at the feast, and who said this, he is the one who has killed my son. These are the kind of sentiments about the gods that will anger us, and anyone who expresses them will be denied a chorus, nor will we allow teachers to use them in the education of the young, because we believe that our guardians, as much as men can be, should be true worshippers of the gods and resemble them. I completely agree, he said, with these principles, and promise to make them my laws. Summary of Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, Socrates and his interlocutors continue their exploration of the ideal city-state. The focus shifts to the upbringing and education of the city's guardians, those responsible for its defense and governance. The chapter begins with the discussion of the basic principles of education for the guardians. Socrates emphasizes the importance of molding their character from an early age, instilling virtues such as courage, moderation, and wisdom. He suggests that exposure to certain stories and music should be carefully regulated to ensure that the guardians develop a harmonious and just disposition. One of the most notable concepts introduced in Chapter 2 is the idea of the noble lie. Socrates proposes the use of a myth to instill a sense of unity and duty among the citizens. According to this myth, citizens are born from the earth, with each person having a metal in their soul, gold for rulers, silver for auxiliaries, and iron/bronze for the commoners. This myth is intended to reinforce the social hierarchy and the idea that each person has a predetermined role in the city. Socrates and his companions also delve into the issue of property ownership within the ideal city. They argue that the guardians should live a communal lifestyle, sharing both property and resources. The goal is to eliminate the divisive influence of private property and wealth accumulation, fostering unity and preventing conflicts over material possessions. Chapter 2 serves as a foundational discussion in the Republic, addressing key elements of the city's structure and the philosophical ideas underpinning Plato's vision of a just society. The concept of the noble lie and the emphasis on the role of education in shaping character are central themes that continue to resonate throughout the work.